Okay. So, I'm just going to offer, does anyone want to share from their table one of either questions? Like, if you guys, I heard some people were more comfortable with the second one, and just to let you know, the caveat is I am a born and bred Bostonian, so please be kind. Or, I mean, if you're comfortable, anyone wants to share about, where their grandparents are from? Anyone here?
What did you say? My grandparents grew up in Cape Verde.
Okay. Cape Verde.
Here's what's interesting too. I'm sorry.
Oh, my grandparents are from Brazil, the Northeast, and my grandma was in the indigenous tribe, and my grandpa stole her.
Your grandpa stole her.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. The second question, I'm a little trepidatious of this. All right. Describe what local Bostonians or New Englanders are like. He pleads the fifth. Anyone else? Straightforward, yes, absolutely straightforward. Any other kind descriptions? Not kind?
I think we're kind, but not nice.
We're kind but not nice. Okay. I get that.
We're used to winning.
We're used to winning. Ouch. You.
People are assertive when driving.
We are quite assertive while driving, yes. Well, thank you guys. Now, these were icebreakers, but I wanted us to start thinking about some of these different concepts that we'll be talking about today. The reason I asked about the grandparents is I've realized over time, I am an American-born Chinese. My parents came here to the States in the late 1960s, and they also brought basically my grandparents, both sides, and all my uncles and aunts from both sides. And they all came here. But what I realized as I grew up, and even now as I reflect back, if I want to understand what my particular ethnic group is Toisanese, the best examples of that, of the culture of the people that I came from, will actually be my grandparents. Because they were the ones that actually grew up for the majority of their lives and through adulthood, that culture. My grandparents came from the village called Toisan. They lived there, they grew up there, they breathed the air, they ate the food, they spoke the dialect. And in many ways, even though my parents are also a good representation of that Chinese culture in particular, but they're not as good as my grandparents. And so that's a little bit of what I want us to start thinking about, just even within our own families, the distance between the culture that we have grown up in, even within our own families, if we just look back with our grandparents, the cultures are significantly different. We feel that. The second one, describing what local Bostonians are like, I was just curious. I'm glad you guys were kind. I know there are much more colorful language that can be used to describe Bostonians. And we'll get into that right now. Culture. This is going to be one of the ideas that we're going to be talking about. What is it? It's a big word. It's a word that's defined differently in whatever specific study that you're in. If you're looking at anthropologists, they'll give you a definition of culture. If you're looking at psychologists, they'll give you a different definition. If you look to theologians, they'll also give you a different definition. I'm just going to go with two, just for time's sake and also just for simplicity. First is from literally a dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary. They define culture as the distinctive ideas, customs, social behavior of a particular nation, society, or group of people. That's a pretty good definition. that culture is a very broad way to describe essentially a way of life, a people that have been shaped and formed. There's a second definition that I found I also really liked, and this is actually from one of my favorite New Testament scholars, friends. His name is Dr. Michael Bird. He defines culture as composed of language, habits, ideas, beliefs, so on and so forth, that culture is plastic, meaning it's shapeable, and it's always evolving. It's inwardly diverse and constantly in flux. And this is what we experience even in our own context here in the United States. The culture that we are in right now is significantly different compared to 25 years ago. Just the passage of time, the things that people value, the way that people think, the things that they care about, all those have shaped and moved as time has gone on. And so culture is a very flexible thing as it continues. One of the things I also want to point out is that he talked about this last line. Culture creates a symbolic world. We intuitively do this. In our minds, we constantly create these connections between objects and ideas. And so, just for a little fun exercise, for the non-Bostonians, for those who are not local, what are these three pictures talking about? Anyone? Non-Bostonian. Those who are from the area, please don't say anything. Okay. Some might say that this is a graffiti traffic sign, which is technically what it is. It's actually supposed to say reverse course. Especially during college move-in season, as truckers are bringing in furniture for college students and they're on Storrow Drive, they're supposed to see this sign telling them, the overpass is too low, turn around now before you get the truck stuck underneath the bridge. And inevitably, there is always one trucker that gets his moving van stuck underneath a bridge, blocks up traffic during the fall. It happens every year. This other sign, I mean, this one's obvious, right? It's a unicorn, a horse with, like a horse that has a horn on its head. And the third one is apparently, I love Citgo gasoline. You should totally go and purchase that gasoline. It's the best brand. No. For a Bostonian, this sign represents the Red Sox must win the World Series. This is not a debatable. We have to win. If you don't know the history about this is simply a callback to a legend about Babe Ruth. He used to play for the Red Sox. He got traded to the New York Yankees. And the legend is that he supposedly cursed the Red Sox for handing him over to New York, and that they would never win the World Series ever since. It took about 86 years. And so a lot of people were really like, we have to reverse the curse of the Bambino, which was his nickname. The second one is actually the symbol for the Boston Marathon. If you are volunteering, if you're running the race, if you get an award, this is the symbol that would be on those medals. And then finally, this is actually a symbol that represents to a lot of Bostonians either Fenway Park or Go Red Sox, because this Citgo sign is seated in the Fenway Park area. And it's so visible from wherever you are around the Boston metro area. If you're trying to figure out where you are, you just look for the Citgo sign and you realize that is my North Star. And that's what it is. What does this all mean collectively? That for me as a Bostonian, it means Boston. It's the things that come up in my mind and even in my heart, in my emotions, when I think about Boston. When we fly in, coming back from Texas, seeing my in-laws and everything like that. I would look out the window at times and I would see the lights of Boston. I have seen the lights of other cities as I've flown in, but every time, some reason, I miss this place. And I don't feel it until the moment I actually see the lights and I see the people walking by and the cars driving by on these very familiar streets. And so this is what is a taste of the symbolic world. We do this so intuitively. When I ask you, what do you think of when the happiest memory that you have as a child? You probably have flashes, images, maybe a toy, maybe a blanket, maybe a smile from one of your parents. There are things that come up that stir up the emotions and the mind, and that is a bit of the symbolic world. I gave this for the last 2 times we did a discipleship class, and I'm just giving this again because we have to acknowledge this is going to be the challenge that we'll be talking about today. We are the products of the 21st century. And even more so, we are the products of the Enlightenment. We have grown up in a society that basically has made the decision the spiritual world and the physical world, those things are separate. There's a hard wall in between. They are not connected at all. And even some would say the spiritual world does not even exist. It's not real. It's fantasy. It's false. But for the world of the ancients, for the ancient Near East that we are going to be talking about today, the spiritual and the physical were not that far apart. They were actually, in their minds, enmeshed with one another. It was a porous boundary. Spiritual beings crossing into the physical beings entering into the spiritual, that they did not see a problem with this as much as we as moderns do. And so that is just a little bit of a qualification. If it sounds strange to you, remember part of that is because we are coming from a culture that has insisted there is no such thing as a spiritual world. And also this is from the last 2 times. And this is just to give you guys a heads up about where I am coming from and how I view the Bible, about how it was created, why it was created. It's called the dynamic theory of inspiration. And in short, and this is a quote from a paper that I wrote for my doctorate right now that I'm working on. In short, my heart belief is that the primary author of the scriptures, the Bibles that we hold in our hands, that is God Almighty. That is the triune God. But he also had no problem with working with human beings to work in tandem together with them to create what we call now the Old and New Testament scriptures. This is a shift in thinking from a mindset that believed human beings are so dirty and so broken that we could never help in creating holy scripture. And the reality is, this is a God who understands where we are from, who we are, and he was willing to work with us. And ultimately, it's because it's coming from this deep-seated belief that Pastor Sharkey and I have been holding and talking about for the last couple of years, is that the scriptures is a family history book, particularly it's God's. And I've said this so many times, contains the memories, the stories, the experiences, the wisdom of a people who have experienced so many things and the things that God desired. Yes, this needs to be shared and this needs to be propagated out. People need to know this. Not for knowledge's sake, but because this is part of our family history. And we talked about it today, and today was the last, talk about the last movement of the scriptures that we're still waiting on. And I didn't get a chance, and Stephen just walked out, so I can say this without maybe possibly tearing up. This is a deep hope of mine. Some of you know 2 years ago, my sister had passed away. And I had always believed in resurrection. But as I saw her at the funeral, and what the cancer had done and ravaged on her body. Resurrection is the only answer. It's not about floating in ethereal clouds. It was wrong. And resurrection is the answer. It was partly why people who were not Jewish, and to hear of this idea of resurrection, what are you talking about? That's not possible. That is what drove the church. Of not just floating in the sky, but one day, everything quality-wise will be renewed, even the brokenness of our bodies. And it clicked for me during that season of life, of how important the message of resurrection is. This is a picture of one of my friends, Dr. Carmen Imes. She is a professor in California at a university called Biola. She's an amazing Old Testament scholar. And she had asked me a few months ago if I would be willing to read an upcoming book of hers that's coming out in October. I did not know it, but as I read it, I realized that she was actually talking about how the scriptures actually are a family history book. I was just floored. It was amazing. She went by book by book by book to show how each of the books in the Old Testament and the New contribute to this idea of all of us becoming part of God's family. The insights, the things to learn. It's like a Cliff Notes version if you're trying to figure how does this all work together. I would encourage you, check out her work and check out this book. It was a blessing. It was really a blessing. And I had no idea that this was what the content of her book was going to be. As we were planning this whole entire sermon series, me and Steven, and all of a sudden I was like, oh my goodness, this is actually talking about the family history book. So I would highly recommend checking her work out. She's an excellent Old Testament scholar. And anyway, I cannot talk enough about her, so I would just stop. Stories matter. This is a quote from a philosopher that I've been listening to and just thinking through some of his work in the last couple of years. And he's reflected on the fact that we're the products of the 21st century, of the Enlightenment. And his conclusion, and I have been thinking about this for a long time, and it's just like there's just a ring of truth in this. The Enlightenment exhausted itself, partly because it was wrong. We were convinced, essentially, that the only real reality is what we can experiment on what we can perceive, on what we can repeat, on what we can observe. Only the theory of perception. That's the only thing that's really true. And his conclusion was that the materialist reductionism of the atheist scientists was wrong. Their theory of perception was wrong. We see the world through a story. We do not see the world as a collection of facts. This was what was propagated, and maybe what you guys might have heard of, called New Atheism, where all of a sudden a bunch of folks who were atheists, and that's fine, but they start evangelizing and basically bashing any sort of religious belief, because in their minds, the only thing that is true is facts, is science, is this and that. And yet when you ask the same people, well, why do you want to go to Mars? Why do you want to study biology? Why? What is driving that desire? They don't know the answer to that. And that ultimately, science is a beautiful thing. I loved it. I loved it as a kid. I was an engineer at college. I still think very methodically like an engineer. But even I have come to realize I don't look back at my life as a collection of facts. I look at life through a lens of a story. I sometimes connect it back to my grandparents. I sometimes connect it to the story that I am right now living. But it is story that we filter life through, not a collection of facts. This theory of inspiration, if I were to break it down into just 3 simple things to take away, God is the overarching author, all of the scriptures. He partnered, and I emphasize he partnered. It's still something I know that's new for a lot of us. But God had always wanted to partner with his creation. And he also accommodated to our understanding of the world. Just as much as those of you who are parents, do not teach your kids the theory of relativity. You do not tell them about certain scientific principles, but you do come down to their eye level and you explain to them why their skin knee is hurting. You try to explain it in ways that they can understand. And there is nothing wrong with the fact that God did the same thing with human beings in ancient days. The Old Testament's cultural river is known as the ancient Near East. It's a broad term. I have mentioned it before. Stephen has mentioned it before. And it simply covers this wide region that we call by these modern names: Kuwait, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Egypt. The earliest records to date that we've been able to find, they go back to 3100 BC. And it approximately ended around 332 BC, around the time when Alexander the Great was expanding the Greek Empire. And by that point, once he conquered most of the Mediterranean, you then start having a fusion of ancient Near Eastern thinking with Greek thinking, and then later when the Roman Empire appears, Roman thinking. It becomes this fusion. But if we're talking about purely about this thought world, this symbolic world, this spans at least 3,400 years. Ancient Israelites, their theology, it actually sometimes swam in the currents of this river. They didn't question certain things about how everyone else around them perceived the world. They agreed with it. They thought, yes, the world was divided up in these ways. And they just generally thought, yeah, everyone knows that. But there were other times when the Israelites, their theology, swam against the current of the ancient Near East. And it is those moments that we have to pay attention to. Now, if some of this is new, and if you haven't heard of this before, part of that is because biblical scholars had known about the ancient Near East. We knew this time period existed. We knew these civilizations, these empires existed. But for the most part, we lost the records. We either lost how to read the languages, speak the languages, or even just the documents themselves were gone. And it wasn't until 1799 when one of Napoleon Bonaparte's soldiers discovered this rock that is known as now the Rosetta Stone. For the first time, we actually got a glimpse of what ancient Egyptian, yes, it looked like, but we actually had a translation of it into Greek. And because of that, for the first time, after over a millennia at least, we finally had a chance to actually understand Egyptian hieroglyphs. And that kicked off a fervor of study as people started discovering more and more documents, not just from Egypt, but from the ancient Near East. Caches of all this literature from the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, it all started being dug up. We started finding this material was actually still in stone or in clay tablets and other materials. But there was a reaction. And I remember a few years ago, Stephen and I had this conversation once at the South Shore Mall. We were having lunch, and I was telling him about my excitement of just learning about this material, and it's like so cool. It's like helping me understand the Old Testament and New Testament a whole lot better. And I remember your question, Stephen, and it was, why is it that we have not heard about this? And the reality is, we actually had heard about it, but there were two reactions. You had scholars who saw this ancient material, and they got so excited. Some of them were so overeager They made the claim the Bible copied from these sources. The Bible is not original. It plagiarized from these societies. And what do you expect would happen in the church when people hear such a thing? An equal opposite reaction. People ran away from this material. They started saying, oh, that's what the liberal scholarship believes, and did not even want to look at the material. Some scholars call this parallelomania versus parallelophobia. Basically, those who thought, I'm seeing everything in the ancient Near Eastern stories in the Bible. The Bible is just basically a cheap copy. And then those who said, no, the Bible is original. If any copying was done, it was because they copied us. Thankfully, in the last 50 to 70 odd years, we've been having a nice consensus that has been growing among biblical scholars. It's been called the contextual method. It sees the fallacies of both of these sides and recognizes the Israelites, they did not copy from the ancient Near East. They were part of the ancient Near East. They were one of the streams of thought in this river that we call the ancient Near East. This is from Kyle Greenwood. He's an Old Testament scholar, and he gave a great definition of the contextual method. And just wanted to provide this for you guys here. It recognizes that the ancient Near East texts arrive from a variety of cultural conditions. Nonetheless, people shared culture concepts. They shared a language, they shared some superstitions, they also shared ideas that were in common about what kingship is like, what life is like, death is like, marriage is like, so on and so forth. There were a lot of commonalities. The Israelites could actually, in some sense, talk with Canaanite neighbors because their languages, even though they were slightly different, they were close enough that they could understand one another. And so there was this sharing of ideas. And in some sense, this is, I think, one of the reasons why you have Exodus 20, where God says to the people of Israel, I've called you to be a kingdom of priests. And that had always confused people for the longest time. But what does a priest do? They stand before God to intercede for the people. Israel was meant to be the intercessors for the rest of us, to tell us about who the Creator is. And that can only happen is if they can communicate, if they can talk, if they can understand each other for the most part. So some definitions and differences. This is a word called cosmology. We do this all the time without even realizing we're doing this. Cosmology is simply the study of origin, structure, and the fate of the world. How did the world come to be, basically? John Walton, he's another Old Testament scholar, he proposes that our modern society, our cosmology is actually science. He says it is represented by science, our own theories of origins and operations. Science provides what is generally viewed as the consensus concerning what the world is. Today, science makes no room for deity, yet at the same time, it also doesn't disprove it. But this is in contrast to the world of the biblical writers, where the power of the gods and the gods themselves were infused in society. They thought this is just a part of everyday life. Versus today, here wide and by, we think God like showing up is just like a strange, weird moment. But the reality is, from the ancients' perspective, the supernatural was involved all the time. If I were to break it down, I think there are essentially two set of questions each of these time periods are essentially asking. For us in the 21st century, we generally like asking the question, when was the universe created? We like to know when. How far back? How many years, Mike? How long ago was it when the universe was created? And then after that, we also want to know how was it created? For the ancient Near Eastern person, instead of when was the universe created, The question for that person was, who created the universe? And knowing that, why was the universe created? And here's a question. These two pairs of questions for each of these different types of thinking, what are the differences? Just hot takes, throwouts. What do you think? What is at the core, you think, of between these two? What is going on, the differences?
Fact versus story.
Fact versus story, yes? Sure, yeah. Intention. Anyone else? I'll leave that open-ended because I have my own ideas, but I do find it I find it very interesting that we as a society in modern Western society, we are so obsessed with figuring out especially the how. Even this past week, I read an article of a new recent discovery that apparently we can now make light into a solid. You can ask me about that later. But it is just like, that is wild. But we are so obsessed with how. And I'm not exactly sure why. There's nothing wrong with how. But why are we so obsessed with it? Now, I risk showing my age. This is a tale of two kung fu movies. Two favorite kung fu movies for me. If you don't know what it is, for those who are younger, on the right is a movie called The Matrix. It came out in 1999. Oh dear. And on the left is another movie called Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Both of them have a lot of similarities. They were released about 20 months apart from each other. They're both martial art movies, right? There's a lot of kung fu that's going on. There's also a lot of like action and fighting and just cool choreographed type stuff. They also feature characters who could perform superhuman feats, jumping off the top of buildings, flying even, fighting with an immense amount of superhuman strength. But The Matrix currently has worldwide grossed over $460 million in the box office, while Crouching Tiger has netted $213 million. Now, I'm not trying to speculate why. I'm just simply saying they're similar, and I want to share a particular experience I had, especially with Crouching Tiger. I went with a friend to watch it when it premiered. We were so excited. This is like the first time an Asian martial arts movie is getting an actual, real American release, proper, promotions. It was all this like, yes, this is going to like introduce the Western world to what martial arts, films could be like in a broader context. And it was great, and we're watching it, and then we get to the first scene where the characters begin flying. And the entire theater, except for me and my friend, erupted into laughter. And the laughter did not stop for the whole rest of the film. People were laughing, they were screaming, they were mocking what they were watching. Now, part of the reason, and I thought about this for a long time, why? When this movie was advertised, and advertised to American audiences, it was advertised as a romance period drama. It was yes, there's some martial arts and you can watch that, but it's primarily a romance, an epic romance of like far back in China. People were not expecting to see people fly. That was not the genre that they came in for. They came in with a certain expectation of what this movie was going to be about. And once they saw something that went against what they assumed this movie would do, laughter broke out. For me and my friend, growing up as a kid, I watched these kind of movies all the time. It's generally called a high fantasy martial arts film, where the assumption, the given is, you don't even have to explain it, is that the martial artists are so good and so powerful that they can even channel the energy inside their bodies to make themselves lighter than air, that they could fight in the sky, that they could fly and get to distant places. It was just an assumption with this genre of literature and movie. And so when I came to watch this, I knew exactly what to expect. And so I bring this up because this is what I think often happens when we encounter these weird supernatural descriptions in the scriptures. Because again, we are products of the 21st century. And if there is this internal reaction of mockery, or this makes no sense, or disgust, it's partly because there is a big cultural gap that we have just now stumbled onto. What you see before you are two concepts. When I say and I think about the world and earth, many of us probably are thinking this. If I were to ask an ancient Israelite, what does the world look like? What's the world made out of? They would probably actually describe it as, it's broken into three parts. The heavens, the earth or the land, and the underworld. I'm pretty sure that is striking some of you very odd. One of my mentors, Dr. Heiser, he wrote this. The Israelites believed in a universe that was common amongst the ancient civilizations of the biblical world. It encompassed those three parts: heavenly realm, earthly realm, and underworld. And what's even crazy is that he pointed out, it's actually in the scriptures, but it just flies by us when we're reading. Exodus 20, verse 4, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. It's there, but because we are not used to thinking this way, it just washes by us. The danger that I kind of felt about showing you guys this picture is that our tendency, because it's such a different worldview, we tend to think this is literal. That they literally thought there were windows in the sky. That they literally thought that the world was flat. That they literally thought. And there's a danger in that, because again, difference in culture. The ancients unified the concrete image and the abstract. They were not separated. They could think of a tall mountain and see it physically as a mountain, and at the same time think of it, that's also where the gods live. They had no problem between going from one to the other. Physical rock, lots of snow on the top, but that's also where the gods live. That it was the one and the same. We have a lot of issues doing that. He continues on, Dr. Hilbert, modern scholars have overread these ancient texts with a literalism that does not respect the sophistication of these ancients. Oftentimes, and this is kind of true, I've read this in the literature before, where biblical scholars would mock this idea because we are automatically thinking this is literal, that this is physical. And that really diminishes and really just kind of, it belittles the ancient author. They did not have cameras. They did not have drones. They did not have satellites. They did not have airplanes. They had no way of literally seeing a bird's eye view. They did what they could from where they were at. This is an aside and an excursus. Science in the Bible. This is a word that I had encountered in the last couple of weeks as I studied and got ready for this. We do this again all the time, but we just don't even know what the term was. It's called concordism. It's essentially the insistence that we have to somehow match up modern science to the Bible. And it takes different forms. Some popular forms that people have done this kind of form of concordism. For example, young earth creationism. There are camps of Christians that believe that the world was created in 6 24-hour day periods, and that the world is no older than probably around 6,500 years old right now, because they are taking it very literally. And some of this, they will even go to the point of, it's not that science should inform the Bible, it's that the Bible should be informing the science, right? That kind of direction. You got old earth creationism that respects things like, yes, a big bang had happened. The world is way older than we thought, such and such. And they try to see the creation account as a little bit more symbolic. These are basically versions of hard concordism, that many scientific truths can be found in the Bible, that somehow the biblical writers wrote down scientific truths without knowing it, or soft concordism. There's some overlap. If these were the only options available, I probably would say personally I lean towards soft. But I also question, why do I have to choose this? Because ultimately, we are talking about two very different things. The Bible is not a science book. We have said this many times, and the reason is because when you go to a science book, you approach it assuming you're going to get a collection of facts, you're going to get paragraphs and essays about data, explanations, a conclusion, a hypothesis. You're going to get that. When I come to the Bible, I am coming to a story, not a collection of facts. And so even the way that we read the material has to be in sync with what the material is. And the challenges I have with concordism, it risks adding and changing the meaning of the scriptural text beyond what the writers originally intended. There's a danger that for us who have gone through theological training, we reminded this so many times. Don't read into the text. Don't put our cultural assumptions on the text. There's a danger because that's a misinterpretation. And also, it's so fluid. Remember what Dr. Bird said. Culture is plastic. It shapes and forms. It changes over time. And so if culture changes and I put my cultural moment onto the text, then I'm saying that this text has basically no relevance 20 years from now. The task that it's really hard, but it's what needs to be done, is to draw the meaning from the text. And that involves understanding what kind of world did the writers live in, so that I understand what are they trying to communicate. The also issue is that the scientific consensus is always moving. The fact that I just now discovered this past week, light can become a solid. I don't know how to process that, honestly, because I'm also instantly thinking of, like, we have now entered the world of Mass Effect, or we've entered the world where all of a sudden light can become a solid, and you can make weapons and whatever else, because I like martial arts. And it also disincentivizes us, right, from learning about this past. And the reason why I care about it is because it's our family history. I want to understand, how did Abraham look and view the world? How did Jesus, how did Paul, how did Peter understand the world? If I understand where they are coming from, then I can understand what they are talking about. And here's the other kind of final issue I have concordism. It was the only interpretive option the church had, because we lost the material. We came to literal interpretations of Genesis 1 because we had no other idea available. That's why. And yet you even have in records folks like St. Augustine, who would look at the days of creation and admit, this can't be literal. I don't know why, but it cannot be literal. It cannot be a chronology. He even knew that it didn't make sense, and he tried to figure out a solution to it, but he didn't have any other tools. But he noticed there's incongruity. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't flow. This here is a portrait of Queen Anne of Cleves. She was one of the wives of Henry VIII of England. Now, according to apparent legend, when King Henry VIII saw this portrait of Queen Anne, he was so smitten that he decided, I must marry her. And eventually she came and they got married, and it didn't last very long because we're talking about Henry VIII. But this portrait is currently in the Louvre. And last year, after 300-something odd years of having it in their collection, they decided, let's go and clean it up. Let's do a restoration work on it. At the end of 2024, this is what it looks like now. They removed literal centuries worth of dust. They crisped up the lines. They brought out the colors and details from the background. It's beautiful. I bring this up because what we are doing today in these background studies, in the stuff that I've been looking and studying and trying to incorporate even into our sermons, is the answer to this question. How then could God have allowed his church to miss the interpretation of Genesis 1? And the reality is, he didn't. Everyone pretty much understood what Genesis 1 was talking about. Physical creation. God is the one who created the world. But layers of richness in the text were lost. And what this study of the ancient Near East is helping us with is to bring out those vibrant colors again, to actually help us see, wow, so this is the message. This is the little poking that the Israelites were saying back to the Babylonians. This is what they were trying to get at in communicating to their neighbors in Canaan. They were trying to communicate something beautiful about our God that unfortunately for so many years, it just went over our heads because we don't live in that literary world anymore. I'm not going to go through all these. You can read this in the handouts, but I gave you a breakdown of the three major stories from the ancient Near East that were significant and really changed the landscape of this whole entire study of biblical literature. The first is called the Enuma Elish. This is essentially the quintessential creation story of the Babylonians. Read it on your own. It's a very violent and bloody tale. And it implies something about the Babylonians themselves. This next one is called the Baal cycle. You might have heard of him. He's a god that appears many times in the Old Testament as a rival to Yahweh. This is one of the more famous stories about Baal, and I didn't have time to go into it. The biblical writers actually take some of that same material and they co-opt it for Yahweh. That's just basically poking back at their Canaanite neighbors of like, oh, you think Baal is the ultimate guy. He's not. This one is the one I do want to work through a little bit because it's an interesting story. This is the Atrahasis epic. It's a Sumerian, Assyrian, and Babylonian story. It's basically their version of the flood story. In short, you had this group of gods who used to do all the work of the universe. They got tired and decided to create lower level gods, the Iggy. I said this yesterday, and my wife just started laughing. I'm doing my best pronunciation. The Iggy. They were the ones who they were also gods, but their main purpose of being created was to essentially do the rest of the work of creation and the work of maintaining the world. One of the jobs that they were in charge of was digging out the path for rivers, apparently. However, of course, after so much time, the Iggy started hating the work. Because, heck, we're gods. Why are we doing this menial work? And so they essentially hold a workers' revolt. They burn their tools, they basically say no more, and they storm the elder gods' homes demanding, we don't want to be doing this work anymore. And so they all agree, all right, we'll make another race to take care of all this work that we didn't want to do, that then we gave you, and then now you guys don't want to do. We'll make another race. We'll call them humans. And the humans are made, and I'm thankful that, well, for the most part, there are no kids. Humanity from this perspective, humans were made from clay, from spit from the gods, and the blood of a god they decided to slaughter. Mix that all together, bake it, and then you have human beings. But unfortunately, after a while, all of the gods got annoyed with humans because apparently we were so noisy. They couldn't get any sleep. They cried out that we would cut the racket, but we didn't. And so their solution ultimately was to send a flood, to kill all of humanity. One god decided, oh, this is wrong, and tells this human, Atreus, and his wife, build a boat, get in there, save yourselves. And they do, and they survive. And when the flood finally ends, he makes a sacrifice and gives it to the gods. But here's the irony. These gods all come to the altar famished. Because in their anger about how noisy we were, they forgot. The humans are the ones who feed us. We have no food. No one is here to feed us. And so by the time the flood ends and there's only one human pair left, they are so hungry and so happy that the human being offered some food on an altar. They all came to the altar and basically ate because they were starving. These gods were starving. They needed human beings to feed them. And so the gods decide, okay, we shouldn't do this again, but we'll make sure that the humans will die from old age, from disease, and we'll even inflict some of them with infertility so that we can control their population because they're so disgusting creatures. Here is the last portion of this epic. He, Atreus, put down, he provided food. The gods smelt the fragrance, gathered like flies over the offering. Nintu, one of these gods, got up and blamed all the gods. Compare this to the biblical flood story at the end. And Noah built an altar to Yahweh, and he took from all the clean animals and all the clean birds and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And Yahweh smelled the soothing fragrance, and Yahweh said to himself, never again will I curse the ground for the sake of humankind, nor will I ever again destroy all life as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. Do you see the difference? In the ancient Near East, the gods needed human beings. It was a necessary evil. The gods couldn't feed themselves. They needed human beings to do it. The gods hated us, but they also needed us. Yahweh, however, he appreciated the token of gratitude from Noah, but Yahweh does not need to eat. Yahweh was the one that saved and took care of Noah during the flood. And because of what the devastation of the flood was, he promised that he would never do this again, even though the reason was because of humanity's wickedness. He wouldn't do it again. That's the moment of the Israelites swimming against the stream. Yeah, there was a flood. But do you know why there was a flood? Was it because we were noisy? No. It's because we were depraved. We were corrupted. We were wicked. We destroyed creation on our own. That's why he sent a flood. And in the end, he doesn't need us, and yet he saved this family. He didn't need us to feed him. We need him to feed us. He's the one that takes care of us. That's the difference. And this is actually one of the reasons why I do love this type of study. It fleshes out the colors of the Old Testament. To wrap up soon, common ancient Near Eastern themes. Creation involved violence. You can read those. There were a lot of civil wars. There was a lot of deicide, which is basically murder of gods. There was a lot of rebellions, so on and so forth. And also creation, by the way, was more of a consequence. They never intended to make the world. It just happened that way. And human beings were indentured servants or slaves to the gods. And also they were not dignified. It's no coincidence that in these stories, when humans are created, that the gods spit at the clay. It means the same thing culturally, no matter how you take it. That it still is a demeaning action. And the gods were petty and short-sighted and foolish. You can check these out on your own, but if I were to recommend, if you're just wading into this cultural river, definitely check out Dr. Heiser's Supernatural book. This is a good primer to understand, and I think Stephen had bought actually 10 copies of it that's available for folks. So please, if you're interested, grab one copy. And then these are additional ones that I would highly recommend if you're wanting to learn more about this world that is still very foreign to many of us in the church. And if you want to dive deeper in, I would recommend these 4 books as well, and more. I also got a little overboard, I admit, with QR codes. This is amazing! I never knew you could create QR codes. So anyways, now I had mentioned this in the last 2 classes, but this is just to give a heads up for many of you guys if you did not know. The event of what happened with Babylon and Israel was a significant turning point for the people of God. It affected everything. It's actually even part of the reason why we have our Bibles today the way they are, because it was necessary. Their nation was destroyed. Their people were about to lose their identity. And so part of the reason why the scriptures were even codified into a text was because we're literally about one generation away from just being absorbed into Babylon and just disappearing as an ethnic group. And so that was part of the motivation. And so if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this and the creation of the scriptures that we have, again, the QR codes, you can check this out and just check out from the last couple of talks that we did. I do want to just close and just point out a few things about the Genesis 1-2 narrative. The reminder is that these are historical narratives, but they're not concerned with an exact date or time. And that always frustrates us as moderns. But the main character of the story is God. And if you notice in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2, it's the same main character who encounters the same kind of pattern. He encounters a problem. In creation, when God began to create heaven and earth, and by the way, as I've insisted before, this is probably the better way of translating verse 1 because of the grammar. Not in the beginning. That's mostly because of tradition. We still do in the beginning. But really, it is better to think of it as when God began to create. When? What's the when? No idea. But that also was not a concern of the biblical writer. What they were concerned about was the problem. The earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the face of the deep. And as I mentioned earlier during our series recently, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, verse 3, these essentially form a picture frame of the 6 days of creation. The focus our eyes should be turning to is the 6 days. That's the picture. So don't get bogged down by essentially the introduction or the ending. Focus within the frame. Genesis 2 does something similar. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. When? When is the when? No idea. When the Lord God made earth and heaven. What's the problem? No shrub of the field. No vegetation. And also, there was no human being to take care of the land. And then finally, this is just sort of a little bit of talking about why I don't think it's a good idea to read the days of creation as a chronology. Because this is what folks like St. Augustine and even St. Origen had noticed. The days of creation had this interesting pattern. Days 1-3 created what looked like domains, realms, space. Days 4-6, residents, inhabitants of those domains. And it all seems to culminate with day 7, the Sabbath. And so for a long time, people had kind of gotten the hint there's something going on with how these days are ordered. I don't think it's beneficial to look at it as a pure, hard chronology. But when we see it this way, and I love how Carmen did this as well, she supplied what is the purpose of each of those. The sun and moon and stars help us with time. The birds and the fish, they occupy the air and ordered space. Day 6, the land and the animals, they live on this dry land. And there's land and food for everyone. It's habitable. There's life now going on. And by day 7, you get rest. I won't go through all of this here, but I do want to get to the last part. I have been having nice conversations with some of you guys coming up after service. This I want to point out. Notice on day 4, the 2 great lights, they refer to the sun and the moon. But why is it that the biblical writers, even though in Hebrew they do have the words for sun and moon, the biblical writer didn't put down sun and moon. Instead calls it the greater light, lesser light. I mean, wouldn't it be easier to save space to just use those actual words we have? The problem is, the sun and the moon were considered by other civilizations, other cultures around Israel, to be gods. And so the writer is actually purposely making a point here. These things that people think are gods, are living beings, they're not gods. They are creations as well. There is only one creator. Also, another interesting thing. Day 5, the great sea monsters. Stephen talked about, and I'm grateful that he mentioned about why John said there was no more sea. If you don't have a sea, you don't have great sea monsters. But it's also because these great sea monsters were also seen as gods. They were seen not just as gods, but primordial gods. They were part of creation. And here the Genesis writer is making it clear. No, they are creatures as well. They are creations of God. They're terrifying creatures. They're scary, but they are still created by the same creator. And that's also partly why that word bara is being used. There's the intentionality. There was a building, a construction of these sea creatures. But don't worry. In day 6, the sea monsters get 1 bara. Humanity gets 3. There is an emphasis on the construction of humans. And there's a greater honor to human beings being made as the representatives of God. I'll let you guys read the rest of it, but I just want to close with this. Some closing thoughts on the Bible's ancient Near Eastern background. This is from Dr. Heiser. He had passed away about 2 years ago, but he's part of the reason why I got into what I have been studying now. Let the Bible be what it is. And be open to the notion that the unseen realm or the spiritual world might just be real. The content of the Bible needs to make sense in its own context, whether or not it makes sense in ours, right? We prioritize what the writers and the audience would have understood. The biblical writers tied passages together in their interpretation, and that should be our guide. The New Testament writers, they repurposed the Old Testament for biblical interpretation. And then finally, the metaphorical meaning isn't less real than literal meaning. And that could be however you define it. The story of the 3 little pigs, it's true. Now, do I really think that there were 3 little pigs dressed in like nice little sailor outfits or whatever else, like, building houses, whatever else? No. but it doesn't mean that it's not true. It doesn't mean that the material, the story, what I'm trying to teach a child with that story is not true. Don't open the door to strangers. Don't build your home from frail, weak things. And then we can even get into a discussion of, like, what are you talking about? Are you meaning a physical house? But it does not mean it is not true. And so I think this is part of the problem. Again, right? We live in post-modernity. We live in a world that assumes the only real thing is what you can see and touch and taste and hear and smell. And yet for the ancient writers of the Bible, reality was spiritual and physical together. And that is part of the task of understanding their world so then we can understand their message. Amen? All right, let me close this in a word of prayer, and thank you guys for listening and coming today. Well, let's pray, because that is that pastor instinct that kicks in. Heavenly Father, I do pray for all of us. I know it was a lot of information and maybe very different from what we have always heard from our churches, from other pastors, from other teachers. Lord, I'm just grateful that you are a God who understands who we are, where we are. You understand how to communicate to us. You have no problem of humbling yourself down to our eye level. And you showed that so many times, even throughout the story of your scriptures. You did not need to come down to look at the Tower of Babel, and yet you did. You did not need to come down and talk with Moses, and yet you did. And you definitely did not need to send your son down to talk and to save all of us, and yet you did. Lord, you are an accommodating God. You are a God who does not need anything from us. You are the God who actually is our supply, our life, the one who takes care of us even when we don't realize it. Thank you that you have always desired to communicate, to talk, to be close and to be near, and that the destiny of all this in the end is that you and us would be together. That this is the family story. So Lord, as strange as this world of the ancient past might seem to us, help us learn and understand really what our past brothers and sisters took for granted so that we can better understand them, but also better understand you. We thank you for our time together. It is in your Son's name we want to pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone.